Hi everyone, and welcome back to my IELTS Writing Task 1 Advanced tutorial. Now, in the previous video, we familiarized ourselves with the format of the IELTS Writing Task 1 academic task, wherein we are given some kind of visual representation, some kind of graphical information, which we are supposed to understand, summarize, identify its main features, and present in an academically written style. The focus of today's lesson is on the different kinds of visual graphical data that we can expect to see on the day of the test. Now, if you've been doing your work and if you've been looking at the different sample tests that are available, especially the official ones that are published by Cambridge, then you will have noticed that there are different kinds of charts. What we're going to do is we'll be going over each type of chart one by one, and in each case, I'll be telling you what the main features are in the type of chart that you should be paying attention to. And also, I'll be telling you about the type of data that these charts represent. You see, although on the surface it seems like you have many different kinds of charts, at the end of the day, essentially, there are three types of data that you are supposed to be familiar with and to be able to describe in academic language. So what I will be doing is I'll be showing you how to see beyond the surface level complexities and the different kinds of visuals, lines, bars, and whatnot, to essentially see the core, the essence of the data. And later, I'll be introducing structures for writing each type of data. So as you can see, the aim is to simplify the process. Okay, let's start with the first type of chart that you can see here. This is a chart that we previously looked at in the previous video. And as you can see, we have the written segment and we have the visual segment, the visual section of this task. Our focus is on the visual section. Now, this type of chart is called a line graph, and I think the name is self-explanatory, right? Because we have the data shown in the form of lines. Now, in a line graph like this, there is always a vertical axis, which is this axis here, and we have a horizontal axis, which is this one here. Most of the time, the horizontal axis will represent time, some sort of division of time. So in this case, we have 1965, 1975, 1985, 1995, and 2005. So as you can see, we have a breakdown of 10-year intervals, right? So from 65 to 75, 75 to 85, to 95, and to 2005, 10-year intervals. Now you could expect days, months, hours, so the scale can vary. But what you will notice is that in the majority of cases, the horizontal axis represents time. The vertical axis, on the other hand, this axis, represents quantities or amounts, right? So in this case, as you can see, next to the vertical axis, we have number of students in thousands. And as you can see, we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. So that means 2,000, 4,000, 6,000, 8,000, 10,000, and 12,000, right? 12,000 what? Students. That's very important for you to remember. Now, the actual data is shown through these lines that you can see, parallel to the vertical, to the horizontal axis, which is basically showing how each variable is changing over time. So for example, we have 4 lines, and so we have 4 variables here. The variables, which we can see here through the description part, represent the types of fields that these students were studying in. So some students were in the engineering majors, some were studying medicine, arts and humanities, and the hard sciences. And the line graph shows how the number of students in each of these different types of courses has changed over time. Right? So for example, we can see here that the number of students in the hard sciences fell from over 10,000 to just over 8,000 students from 1965 to 2005. So as you can see, in a line graph, we're always concerned with describing changes over time. Talking about increases, talking about decreases, talking about fluctuations, do you see? And so, as we will later review, this type of data is quantitative and it is interval, meaning it's showing changes across time. More on that later. Okay, so we've covered the first type of chart, which is the line graph. It has a vertical and a horizontal axis. The horizontal axis represents time, the vertical axis represents quantities, and the lines themselves represent the variables that are shown, right? The data is embedded in the variables itself. Okay, moving on to the next type of chart that you may encounter, and it looks something like this. Once again, as you can see, we have a description, instructions, and the chart itself. To familiarize ourselves with the chart, we'll very quickly read the description. It says, the bar chart below shows the percentage of people owning different types of vehicles by fuel type in a European country. The instructions is, again, the same thing we've seen before. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Now, the task has just told us that this is a bar chart. Now, similar to the line graph that we just saw, we have another vertical axis and a horizontal axis. So as you can see here, the vertical axis, we have different kinds of vehicles. We have vans, hatchbacks, sedans, SUVs, minivans, and trucks, right? Now, in the line graph, if you recall, the horizontal axis represented time. This time, there is no time. It's different types or different categories of the data. So if we're looking at vehicles here on the horizontal axis, we can see different categories, different classifications, different groups of vehicles. The vertical axis, which you can see here, again, similar to, this time similar to the line graph, represents data amounts or quantities. In this case, it's percentage of people, right? So putting this together with what we saw in the question, so the percentage of people owning different types of vehicles. So it shows vehicle ownership across different categories, right? So as you can see, we have quantities, once again, in percentages represented by the vertical axis, and different types or classifications of the data represented on the horizontal axis. Now, are we only viewing the different kinds of cars based on the type, like whether they're vans or hatchbacks or sedans? No. If you look a little closely, you'll see that there is a different criteria. There's a second criteria for dividing up the cars, and that is based on the fuel type. So here we can see electric, gas, and diesel cars, right? So electric cars, gas-fueled cars, and also diesel cars. So if someone were to ask me on the horizontal axis, how many criteria do we have? How many variables do we have for the division of information? I would say there are 2. Now, don't get confused. You might say, hey, wait, van, hatchback, sedan, SUV, minivan, and truck, that's 6. How are you coming up with 2? You see, van, hatchback, sedan, SUV, minivan, and trucks, they are different categories of the same variable that's distinguishing, that is the type of vehicle. Another variable, which this time divides the information into 3 types, is the fuel type, right? So the 2 variables, the 2 criteria, let's call it criteria. The 2 criteria for dividing up the information are A, the types of vehicle, based on which we have 6 categories, and then we have fuel type, based on which we have 3 categories. Understanding this is very important, and we're going to practice it later, because this and understanding these types of classifications and categories will help us determine how many paragraphs we should write in the body section of our report. So this is going to later play a role in the way we present our report. Now, what kind of data are we dealing with here? Again, it's quantitative. How do we know it's quantitative? Because we have numbers. Whenever you look at a chart and you have percentages or numbers with units like kilograms, grams, and what have you, then you're dealing with quantitative data. So the line graph we saw before and the bar chart that we can see here, they are both showing quantitative data. But there is a difference. In the line graph, the quantitative data we saw was focused on changes, increases, decreases, stability, that kind of information. Whereas here, in this chart, we don't see whether the number of people driving vans has increased or decreased. Time isn't a variable. So we're not talking really about increases, decreases, and fluctuations. Rather, here, we're more interested in comparisons. So we can look at the chart and we can say that, for example, the category of cars which most people owned were sedans and SUVs. So more people owned sedans and SUVs than, there were more people who owned sedans and SUVs than those who owned vans, trucks, minivans, or hatchbacks. So you see, when I'm reporting this information, rather than talking about how something has increased, decreased, or changed, I'm more interested in drawing comparisons across categories, whether it is comparing vans to sedans or whether it is comparing gas cars to diesel cars. Sometimes the comparisons can even be more nuanced than that. For instance, you might be comparing the number of SUVs that are fueled by diesel to the number of sedan vehicles that are fueled by diesel. So as you can see, there's plenty of opportunity for us to compare across these various categories. So while in the line graph that focused on increases, decreases, and generally changes through time, we refer to the data as interval, here we refer to the data as discrete. So very briefly put, interval data is any type of data that focuses on changes across time. Discrete data, on the other hand, is any kind of data that doesn't focus on changes across time, but rather compares categories to each other. Okay, so we've looked at line graphs, which contain quantitative data, which is interval. And we've also looked at bar charts that contain quantitative data that are discrete. Moving on to the third category of data. So we've looked at line graphs, bar charts. Now let's look at something that is perhaps more familiar to most of you, which is the table. Let's read the description first. The table below shows the percentage of annual income spent on 3 product categories in 5 countries. The instructions are the same. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Now, let's look at the table. As you can see, in a table, we typically have a series of rows and a number of columns. In this case, we have 5 rows, each corresponding to a different country, and we have 3 columns, each representing to a different category of product, right? So we're looking at food, clothing, and electronics in Denmark, Italy, Greece, France, and Poland, right? So this should give you a fairly good idea. But what are these percentages we need to know? It's the annual income that's spent, right? So it's very straightforward. You can basically point to any one of these cells and you should be able to tell what is being shown. So for example, here, 28.91% food Denmark, right? So it means people from Denmark, this is how much they spent on food, right? Very straightforward, very easy, and it's something that most students have relatively less difficulty dealing with. Now, what kind of data are we dealing with? Is it quantitative or is it qualitative? Once again, we're dealing with numbers. We have, figures and percentages, so it's quantitative in nature. But here's the second question. Is it interval or is it discrete? Remember, interval is when we are showing changes over time. Discrete is when we're looking at the data fixed in time, but we're basically drawing comparisons, right? Here, we can't see how, Denmark's spending on food has changed across time. This table doesn't give us that information. So it can't be interval. It must be discrete, right? Because the aim is to compare, the percentage of income that the Danish spent on food compared to how much the Italians spent on the same category, or perhaps how much the Italians spent on food compared to how much they spent on the other 2 categories of clothing and electronics. So once again, in this case, we're dealing with quantitative and discrete data. Okay, so far we've covered 3. We have a few more types of chart to go. Let's take a look at this chart here, which is a pie chart. All right, so we have 2 pie charts actually, and this also reminds me to tell you that sometimes on the test we may have more than one type of chart together. We call these combination charts, and we're going to return to them. Combination charts sometimes include 2 of the same kind of chart. So for example, here we have 2 pie charts. You may have a pie chart and a line graph, or a bar chart and a table, right? So sometimes you have 2 or 3 charts of the same type in one task. Sometimes you have 2 or 3 charts of different, categories in the same task. Let's read the description first. The pie charts below show the popularity of different sports among male and female athletes in a small Australian town. The instructions are the same. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Okay, time for us to look at the data in these charts, in these pie charts, and to see how they are similar and in what ways they are different from the previous types of data that we've looked at. So the pie chart on the left says percentage of male athletes, and the pie chart on the right reads percentage of female athletes. In each of these charts, we have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 categories, right? So we have basketball, table tennis, chess, cycling, track and field, swimming. Same categories for the female students, right? Female athletes. But the categories, the percentages are different. And if you've worked with charts before, you know that pie charts also represent quantitative data. How do I know this? Well, I see numbers. Whenever you see numbers, then you know you're dealing with quantitative data. Here we have, for example, for male athletes, we have basketball, 26%, swimming, 10%, track and field, 11%. So whenever there are numbers, we're dealing with quantitative data. So that's easy. But is it interval or is it discrete? This question that we've been answering so far for each of these types of charts. In this case, once again, I need to ask myself, am I able to see how each of these categories, or perhaps some of them, have changed over time? Can I see how the percentage of males athletes who are playing basketball, has there been an increase in the number of male basketball players, or a decrease? I don't know. This chart, the pie charts don't show us that information. All they do is allow us to compare across categories. I can compare the percentage of male basketball players to female basketball players, or I can compare the percentage of male athletes who are engaged in basketball compared to the percentage of male athletes who are into cycling. So once again, the purpose is to compare these different categories. Therefore, I'm once again dealing with discrete data that is quantitative, right? So quantitative and discrete. Okay, so far we've looked at line graphs, which are quantitative interval. We've looked at bar charts, which are quantitative discrete. We've looked at tables, which are quantitative discrete. Pie charts, as we've just seen, are also quantitative and discrete. Time for us to look at the next type of chart, and this one is called a flow chart. Now, flow charts are sometimes a little confusing for some students because if you just statistically look at the samples that are provided, we have relatively fewer flow charts compared to the different types of charts that we've reviewed so far. So you're likely to see more pie charts, line graphs, tables, bar charts relative to flow charts and visuals that have illustrations in them, do you see? But let's learn about this type of chart and let's see what kind of data it holds. I'll read the description. The flowchart shows the process involved in producing pulp from wood and how the pulp is used to produce paper. The instructions remain the same. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Now, the first thing you'll likely notice as you look at this flowchart here is we don't have numbers. So do you see percentages? Do you see any figures in there? No. Not really. No numbers. And so whenever there are no numbers involved, you know that you're dealing with qualitative data. So here we have a qualitative chart that is showing a process. So you see, if it's not quantitative, then it can't be interval or discrete, because interval and discrete were subcategories of quantitative data. When we're dealing with qualitative data, in IELTS, it's always a process. So what do we see here? Here we see the process through which paper is produced, right? So we have conifer trees, they're logged, and the wood is used to create, bark, and they're the bark is then used to create wood chips. So as you can see, there are steps through which this process results in the production of paper. And this type of chart will be written differently compared to the quantitative charts that we looked at already. Some students say, oh, these kinds of flow charts and qualitative data are more difficult, and some students find it easier. It really depends, but we're going to learn some really good structures, and later I will show you exactly how to construct your response, regardless of whether you're dealing with quantitative or qualitative data. So suffice it to say that this type of data is qualitative and it describes a process. Finally, the last type of chart that we need to learn about is the map. And I'll start by reading the first part of the task, right? So as you can see, it says the maps below show the plan of Woodbridge Shopping Center in 1984 and 2002. The instructions are, again, the same. Summarize, select, report, and make relevant comparisons. Here, as you can see, we actually have two maps, right? So we have the map corresponding to what the shopping center looked like in 1984, and then we have a similar map this time showing how the shopping center has changed over time in the year 2002. And if you look closely, you'll notice that there are certain changes. So for example, there was no parking lot in 1984, but there's a parking lot in 2002. There used to be a lake, and now the lake has been replaced, and the restaurant has been added, or other changes that you can also view in this in these two maps. So again, the question you need to ask yourself is, what kind of data are we dealing with? Is this qualitative or is this quantitative data? I don't see any numbers in there, so it must be qualitative. So just like the flow chart that we just reviewed, here we're dealing with qualitative information. And is it different? Is it a different kind of qualitative information, or is it the same as the flow chart? Now, surprisingly, even though they're different on the surface, one was a flow chart and this one's just two maps, in spite of this surface level difference, if you look very closely, you'll see that both the flow chart and the map are describing a process. In the flow chart, we were looking at the process of how paper is produced. In the map, we have a process of how this shopping center has evolved, changed, and perhaps improved over the years. So once again, we're dealing with qualitative data, which is process in nature. Okay, now let's try to review everything we have learned so far about these kinds of charts. So what are the different types of charts in IELTS Writing Task 1? Well, that's easy. We had a line graph, we had the bar chart, we had the table, the pie chart, the flow chart, and finally, the map. All right, so we basically have 5 categories. If you add the combination chart to it, you actually have 7. But what you need to remember is that the combination chart isn't a separate type of chart. It's a combination of the previous 6, right? So again, we might have a line graph and a table forming a combination chart. We might have a bar chart and a pie chart forming a combination chart. Sometimes we have multiple pie charts. So you might have 4 pie charts forming a combination chart or a combination task, if you will. But one thing you should note is that the combination chart will never combine qualitative and quantitative data. So you will rarely, if ever, find a line graph and a map put together. Why is that? Because a line graph is quantitative and a map is qualitative, right? Okay, so let's categorize the data very quickly. Line graph, what kind of information were we dealing with? Well, we were dealing with quantitative data. And was it discrete or interval? It was interval, right? So quantitative data, interval. And when I say interval, I mean we can view describes changes in quantities, I think this is the best way to put it, over time. Okay, there. Let's move on to the second category. So the bar chart, once again, it was quantitative in nature, but the difference was that this time the data seemed to be discrete, meaning it doesn't describe changes over time, but describes quantities across different groups or categories. This is very important, right? So I'll just add this here. And as you can see, it's quantitative and it is discrete, showing the changes in the quantities across categories, right? Not over time. What about a table? Once again, we had numbers, so it was quantitative, and it was just like most bar charts that you see, discrete. And what does that mean? It means we can say that once again, it describes quantities across categories, right? So we can see that here we have discrete data, which describes quantities across different groups or categories. Okay. Now, before we proceed, I just have to point out something very quickly. I know that I told you that bar charts and tables are discrete. However, sometimes on the exam, the examiner or the test designer will try to trick you. It's not impossible for a bar chart to have time on its quantitative axis, and instead of showing the variables using a line, you just have all these bars next to each other and you can trace the change over time. Don't be fooled by surface level variations. Pay attention to what the data is showing, okay? So most of the time it'll be discrete, but be on the lookout, watch out for instances where, for example, a table could have the years shown in its columns from, let's say, 2021 to 2024, right? So as you can see, we can trace the changes over time, even though it's a table. But these cases are quite rare. What about flowchart? Once again, I think you would agree with me that this is quantitative and that it is discrete, which means it's describing quantities across different groups again. But there's a slight difference that I perhaps didn't mention in my previous explanation. And that is, in a pie chart, we're dealing with a fixed amount. Do you see? It's like a pie or a pizza where you can see a share from a total sum. So everything adds up to 100%. So now what you do is you don't just see different categories, you also see proportions, fractions, and percentages, right? So in a table, you may have percentages. In a bar chart, you may have percentages, but in a pie chart, you always have percentages and a fixed total amount. So keep that in mind, even though we're going to review this later in one of our future lectures. What about a flow chart? Now, in a flow chart, we were dealing with qualitative data, meaning we didn't really have numbers anymore. We were looking at qualitative changes, how paper is produced. So we saw the process, right? And the way we can describe this is it basically shows, or it describes how changes have occurred over time. Right? That's what this type of chart is primarily dealing with. Finally, a map. Very similar to a flowchart. It is qualitative. And once again, it's describing, it's showing a process, which is basically revealing how changes have occurred over time. This time, we usually have a location, right? A map where something has been added, something's been removed, something's been altered. And so these are the different kinds of charts. Now, we've seen all these different categories, but what I'm trying to teach you here is that you shouldn't really be fooled by all these surface level variations. At the end of the day, what are the categories of data in the IELTS exam? It's very simple. We have 3 different types of charts, regardless of the surface level, right? Essentially, you need to learn to write 3 types of reports. 1, quantitative interval. This is when you get a line graph or maybe a bar chart that shows time, variation across time on one of its axes, or maybe a table that has time for columns or rows. This essentially would require you to write a quantitative and interval report. The second category is quantitative discrete. This is when you get a bar chart that's comparing different categories, a pie chart, or a table which doesn't have time as either the column or listed in its rows. So this is the second type of data. And the third type of data that we have is basically qualitative data, which tends to be process in nature. And what we are going to do in the remainder of this course is we're going to learn how to develop a meaningful response that matches the expectations listed on the rubric for each of these types of reports. We're going to learn structures for each category, and then towards the end of this course, I will write a sample response for each of these types for you. And so just by following my lead, by learning these structures, you will be very well positioned to form a very good response on the day of your test. All right, that's it for today's lesson, guys. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. In the next lesson, we're going to delve a little bit deeper into these types of reports, and we're going to focus on the planning, meaning before we begin to write, what are the questions we need to answer? And also, how could we possibly organize our response? How many paragraphs are we going to write? And how to begin, basically, and what to include, how to summarize the information. Really important stuff coming up in the next lesson. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this content, please share, like, and subscribe. And keep in mind that by becoming a member of this channel, you can have access to complete tutorials and bonus content. Catch you all in the next one.